They bought a list and then they were cold calling, and they found out that a significant number of the people on the lists that they had bought had explicitly opted out to receiving cold calls. Sales should know that they shouldn't be calling people on the CTPS list, and marketing should know when and when they shouldn't be sending emails. GDPR will either make you as a salesperson look good and look trustworthy, or it can make your company look sketchy. It can make you look untrustworthy and therefore more difficult to win that sale. That's not necessarily a sales objection, it's them invoking a right.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sales Cadence podcast. My name's Matt Sykes, I'm your host, and joining me on the episode today is Charlie Gretton from the DPO Centre. Charlie is an absolute expert when it comes to all things GDPR. He's also a pretty damn fine sales guy as well. So what you're going to hear over the next 40 minutes is Charlie's advice, because I've really brought him onto the episode to give people like you, especially those guys and girls who are listening who have a sales role, to give you more advice around the world of data protection. Because let's be honest about it, it's one of those things that we all know of, but probably very few of us know much about. And there are some really interesting rules around data protection, and there are some pretty difficult, challenging places that you can get yourselves into if you fall foul of those rules. And the reason I wanted to get Charlie involved was because I wanted to share with the sales fraternity what are some of those things so that you're more aware about it, you can do something about it, or at least you can find somebody in your business or someone outside who can help you navigate those dark waters. It's a really fascinating conversation. It's a bit of a Q&A. I know a little bit about the subject matter, and so I'm guiding Charlie a little bit along some do's and some don'ts. And he gives some really great advice. Expect to hear about the pitfalls of marketing, lead generation, the do's and don'ts about how you can reach out to a cold list, some of the challenges around some different rules. So if you're selling in different countries, there might be some changes afoot that are going to impact that. So it might be one of those ones where you do go and get a pen and a paper. I'll leave you to decide that. But anyway, without further ado, following the music, I haven't yet had an email from anyone saying, really hate that music. You can always fast forward, you know. There are some shows out there, I'm not going to mention them, but you have to go 6 minutes to get past the ads at the beginning. Yeah, that doesn't happen on this one. You've only got to do 30 seconds. Charlie Gretton, welcome to the Sales Cadence podcast.
I'm really happy to be here. This is really cool, Matt.
It is really cool, isn't it? And I'm really happy you're here too, Charlie. And I know that the listeners are going to be really happy at the end of this session because we're going to talk about something which, to some extent, it's a bit like that little voice that sits on your shoulder if you work in sales and you can keep trying to ignore it. But the whole world of GDPR, I think, is quite a key one for the salespeople to learn a little bit more about, and that's really why I've asked you to come onto the show. So I'm really grateful that you've given us some time to come on. Just help the listener, Charlie. Just give us a little bit of a background. First of all, tell me what you do, and then we'll explore a little bit about your background.
I work with the DPO Centre, who's the effectively the largest team of actual DPOs in Europe. And what I do every day is sell GDPR consultancy and outsourced DPO roles.
Fabulous. Full disclosure, I know Charlie quite well. We've worked together. So what you're going to hear from Charlie is here's a subject matter expert who also sells, which is a rare breed in my world. So Charlie, I'm going to obviously point out the fact that you ain't a Brit, mate. You sound like you're from somewhere else. Where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Western Canada and moved to the UK just over 3 years ago. Moved to the UK during quarantine, which was a wild time to move over the Atlantic.
Do you mind me asking what the reason was behind the move?
Well, it was just my partner's from Cambridge, and during quarantine, Montreal was insane. Basically, it was full on police cars driving up and down the street telling people to stay inside, only one person out of the house at any given time. And at the time, Boris was still playing the let's try to do nothing game. So it was quite favorable to move over here for work.
Fun times. I remember them well. And so Always ask any guest that comes on the show a couple of stock questions. Really curious to know, Charlie, if you go back into your younger years, and I think you might even be able to give us a couple of answers here. But the first place I'd like to go is really, really, really early in your education years. So maybe if there's a primary school equivalent over in Canada, or certainly high school, something will have happened where you decided not having any money in my pocket sucks. So I'm going to go out and do some kind of job at the weekend or something. Do you remember? Did you ever have a sort of a weekend job or something like that put $1 in your back pocket?
Yeah, I had in university and in high school, I had a bunch of different jobs selling, working retail, selling patio furniture or shoes or firewood. And
The firewood. Tell me about the firewood. How did that work? What did you have to do?
well, that was
Knock on someone's door and just try and flog them some wood?
sure, yeah. I mean, that was a gig whereby there was I was working on a high end golf course, and we were cutting down a grove of trees, 250 trees that we were felling. And the natural problem in felling trees is, what do you do with the firewood, right? So the superintendent, he tried getting rid of it for free, because it wasn't really firewood, right? It just needed to be seasoned, but he was trying to get rid of it for free and was having a tough time doing that. And myself and a friend, we said, we'll get rid of it for you, basically. And we took it off site, took it to a farm nearby, split it, and then sold it for a profit. And that was a fun time.
I love that. That sounds really quite entrepreneurial.
Yeah, one of those jobs where it's finite though, right?
Well, you run out of wood, you kind of game over.
Yeah, you just take the opportunity and you run with it while you can.
Yeah, good. Okay. And so, you're an expert in the world of data protection. You're also an expert in the world of sales. So you're bringing those two worlds together. When I asked the question about, if you do go back to high school, remember that time when you sat in that classroom and someone was giving you some careers advice, the classic, okay, team, you got the whole world ahead of you. You can be anything you want in this world. What do you want to be? Politician, astronaut, scientist, salesperson? How come you're in sales now? What brought you to the world of selling?
I tried a few things beforehand. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a paramedic, but soon found out that I was not going to cut it as a paramedic. And in a few of the different jobs that I had as a student, working in warehouses and doing retail and what have you, I just thought it would be cool to have a job where you talk for a living, because in many of those jobs, talking is frowned upon, right?
Combine it with a bit of listening, and you've got the perfect combination, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And
But how I fell into GDPR was in moving to the UK. I found myself working for predominantly a pen testing house that did some GDPR consultancy on the side. I thought the GDPR stuff was interesting in the high level hypotheticals of trying to regulate how organizations are using data, and really pushed into it. That's how I ended up where I am now.
briefly, what's a typical day for you look like then?
Typical day is sitting in on initial calls with clients, follow-up calls, the full sales cycle from contact form through to signature on a piece of paper, and then kicked over to project management, of course.
So you really are taking a lead and turning it into an opportunity, and therefore into a sale, right?
Exactly.
Love it.
Yep.
Absolutely love that. So before we get into the main event, Charlie, any advice? I mean, obviously you've sat on both sides. You've worked in a technical environment. You're now combining that with a world of sort of commercial acumen. What advice for anyone thinking about moving into the world of sales? Because we sometimes get quite a lot. There's a bit of a negative perception to some extent about people don't actively look for a role in the sales environment. They tend to fall into one, and that may well be true. But what would your advice be to anyone who's thinking about a career in sales?
The biggest advice that I'd have is know that sales predominantly is done by listening and understanding what the problem is of your customer. So it's not about talking. And as well, sales is not customer service, right? Your job isn't to be, it's not to be liked, even though being likable helps.
Yep, I'd agree with
helps
that.
make friends.
Yep.
But your job as a salesperson isn't to make friends necessarily. It's about putting money in the bank, to put it really bluntly.
No, I think you should. There's quite a lot of information out there, especially on LinkedIn, where I personally believe, whilst we always put prospect or the buyer front and center of the conversation, I fear there's a little bit that we're moving too far in that direction, and we have to accept the fact that we're employed by organisations, or if we work for ourselves, the fundamental requirement is to put money in the bank, as you said. So amen to that. Right, let's get into the main event, Charlie. So I can remember back in the day, it's a little bit like when the millennium hit and the year 2000 clicked in, and we were all spooked a year before about the fact that the world was going to come to an end, and we all had to switch our computers off before midnight on 1999. And then we tipped into 2000 and nothing really happened. I'm going to liken that to 2018 when GDPR became a thing. Let's set the scene. What is the GDPR, Charlie?
Well, really bluntly, it's an attempt by governments to regulate the ways in which organizations are processing personal information. I say attempt because at this point, it's not necessarily the regulators that are governing the market. It's more so the market that's governing the market, meaning customers.
Okay. And so there's a set of rules, essentially.
Yeah, a set of rules for how businesses should be processing personal information, and then as well, a different countries have their own guidance on what they believe the best practices should be, which ultimately governs how customers perceive different products and services, and how due diligence questions and questionnaires come out and get pushed across the table.
Okay. Now, I don't want us to get stuck in the weeds here. Today's episode really is about just trying to keep it as high level and simple for more salespeople than anybody else to be aware of. But of course, data protection is going to impact pretty much everybody in some way, shape, or form to different degrees. But so, if the GDPR is a set of rules and it applies to organisations, I suspect that there must be some critical touch points within that salespeople need to be aware of, right?
There sure is. I think at its bones, GDPR will either make you as a salesperson look good and look trustworthy and look legitimate, or if GDPR and PECR compliance isn't done correctly, it can make your company look sketchy, it can make you look untrustworthy, and therefore more difficult to win that sale effectively.
Okay, you mentioned PECR there, but just explain what PECR is.
Sure. So GDPR being the ways in which businesses should process information, PECR being the ways in which organizations should engage with prospects, specifically B2C.
Okay. And so if I'm a sales guy and I want to reach out to a list, scrape that list, or I bought that list, can I just go out to them and start hitting them with some cold emails?
As the salesperson, always recommend speaking to the DPO first. Use your DPO if you have one as much as you can for stuff like this, just because it depends, and it depends on the industry that you're in. It depends on the type of customer that you're engaging with. But if you're going to be taking a cold call list that you've bought, run it through what's called the telephone preference service or corporate telephone preference service, and then make sure that you have, if possible, consent to be engaging with these people.
So what does consent mean?
Consent means that someone has explicitly opted into receiving communications from you.
Yeah, so they ticked a box.
Exactly. They've ticked a box, or in the case of like if you're on a call and someone says, send me an email, now you have consent to send them that email.
Got it. So you've got to have some way of tracing back the fact that they gave you permission for you to send them something. And what's the we're not here to scare anybody. That's not the point of the episode. We're here to give advice and help people. But what's the downside of doing that?
The downside of doing that is, first and foremost, you're going to get more data subject access requests, i.e. people saying, send me all the information that you have on me. Potentially you get more complaints, and therefore you get more potential questions from your regulator, whatever country you're in. And then, of course, you're going to have some more vexatious conversations with people that you're engaging with, prospects that you're engaging with. I think with most companies, it's taking a risk-based approach.
Everybody has the right to effectively ask somebody if they're holding data, and if they are holding data, what data they hold. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. So if you cold call a prospect and the prospect says, send me all the information you hold on me, that's not necessarily a sales objection. It's them invoking a right.
And that is something that organisation that receives that request, they have to act on, correct?
Correct.
And so,
Within a
okay, so now,
specific amount of time.
right, so there's some rules around how quickly you need to do that. Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
so I'm already starting to make a list in my head now of all of the potential. I know you said risk-based approach. You gave a really good example, by the way. Sort of brings to mind the big boys like Facebook and Instagram who do get fined, but actually it's a very small percentage of their income, and therefore it's a risk worth taking, right? Even though, and we should probably touch on this as well, nobody wants to be seen globally to be abusing people's data.
No, there's a significant reputational risk.
Correct.
And I
And that
think
sometimes is
that,
immeasurable compared to a fine, right?
of course, yes.
So,
Um,
problem number one for salesperson is if they are going out to unknowingly approaching someone with a cold outbound, and then receiving a subject access request, which they'll probably think, well, I don't know what this is.
mm,
I assume if an organization doesn't have a data protection officer within their company, then they need to find someone to help them pretty quickly, right?
yeah,
Because they've got to do something. And you mentioned there as well the regulatory authority. So here in the UK, it's the ICO, isn't it? It's the Information Commissioner's Office.
correct.
And there are different ones in different countries.
Yep.
And so, sort of message number one to anyone in sales who's listening to this and is using the outbound email strategy, you might just want to do a little bit of digging. If you haven't got a DPO, you need to go and have a conversation with someone who knows what they're talking about, just in case you do find yourself in that difficult situation of emailing someone who hasn't given you consent. Worse than that, going and buying a list off ideally a reputable organisation and finding out that half the list have opted out as well. That's a sin and a half, that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Which happens more often than you think.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then when you just touched on a fine. So remind me, and again, highly unlikely, I suspect this happened to most organisations, but if it does, you're on the receiving end of what sort of fine?
Well, the fear mongering number is 4% of global turnover, right? Generally speaking, the fines are significantly lower than that. However, being in sales, the ICO is really, really hot at the moment on unsolicited cold calls and unsolicited cold emails, and those are receiving the highest frequency of fines.
Got it. So if we think then about, and let's keep this to sort of lead gen perhaps, and maybe in the environment, the outbound email world. Let's say, for example, I haven't given consent, but I still receive some form of outbound message to me, an email. Is there
Mhm.
any reason why someone could do that and do that in a, should we say, a legitimate way?
They could rely on legitimate interest.
A couple of times now you've mentioned the phrase DPO. What does DPO stand for?
Data protection officer.
Okay,
Effectively, a DPO within a business is the person who's responsible for the compliance of that organization.
okay, and will every business have to have one?
Not necessarily, but every business needs to have someone who's responsible for GDPR.
Are there sort of rules around how would someone know if they need one?
To quote GDPR, you must have a DPO if you're processing large volumes of special category data, special category data being stuff like religious affiliation, political affiliation, any health data, sexual orientation, stuff like that. Or you're doing systematic monitoring of people and collecting special category data. Or the last one is if you're a public body. Those
Okay,
are when you absolutely do need a DPO in the legislation. But I think what I see for a lot of businesses, and it's from a due diligence point of view, is they need not necessarily a DPO in title, but they absolutely need someone who's an expert in GDPR to help them surpass the due diligence problem, i.e., having the documents in place that their customers are going to be asking for, especially in the B2B environment in the UK.
can you give me an example of a typical organisation that would fall into that, high volumes of sort of, I think you described it, special category data. So it sounds like sort of sensitive or very interesting kind of data. Is there an example or a couple of examples of those sorts of, what sort of sectors?
Sure. So, health tech SaaS business selling a tool that's going to be collecting patient information, and they're
Right.
selling it to a hospital. absolutely. The whole point of the tool is to collect health data, right?
Sure.
That'd be a really easy cut and dry example.
Okay. And banks and stuff like that, I guess, must fall into it as well if they're handling
Banks, in many
person.
cases, I think
Yeah.
in the finance industry, just because finance and fintech is more compliance heavy,
Yeah.
there's higher demands from a due diligence perspective.
So what about small businesses? Really, really small ones. I don't know. It could even be sole traders, perhaps. But let's say you're an organisation with less than say 10 employees. You are handling. Let's say you're a marketing company. Probably doesn't fall into the category of special data, but you are, doing a lot of outbound marketing on perhaps on behalf of your clients. Would you need a DPO then?
That's a really good question. You may not need a DPO in name, but what I always recommend is having someone on tap, even if it's just on an ad hoc basis, to help you out with, like I say, the due diligence problem, to help you out with making sure that you don't look sketchy in the eyes of your customers, especially if you're a small organization that's trying to get your foot in the door.
It's sketchy. I love that.
Mm,
Okay, and I suspect that's probably where your organisation fall into play, isn't it?
yeah,
Just
exactly.
it's a good opportunity. Just to, so you're providing that DPO as an outsourced person, right?
Yeah, how we work effectively is offering a time with an expert on a fractional basis. Generally speaking, the types of clients that we work with are anywhere between 10 employees to 450 employees. The reason why those numbers really is I find startups, especially, eventually they hit a wall where they need GDPR compliance to surpass the due diligence problem, and they see GDPR compliance as the way to surpassing that problem, of course.
Yeah.
And then beyond is where we start to see clients leaving us, which we see as a success, because they're leaving us to hire in their own in-house DPO or their in-house expertise.
So I think what I'm piecing together is there's probably some key roles. So if we keep in the world that we're in, which is sales, we just push the envelope a little bit wider in so much as I'll bring marketing into that. It feels like if you're in a marketing role, you kind of need to understand GDPR, right?
Yeah.
And
The
I just
sales and marketing are the most externally facing, and
yeah,
uh,
but I'm gonna say that whilst I'm not going to let any salespeople off, but it
yeah,
feels a little bit like it's the marketing team that should probably have more understanding and awareness around this because because back to your very valid point at the top of the episode, Charlie. Sales is
yeah.
different to marketing. Sales is the bit like you found me a lead. We can add lead gen into that, but let's just say really fundamentally, a sales role is different to a prospecting role. A sales role is
Of
going to help
course.
someone have a conversation and get to an end decision. In front of that, then a lead gen, and that for me works more in the world of marketing. So it feels a little bit like marketing needs to take the lead on data protection.
Yes and no. I think each department should take each department should know what they need to know in the
Yeah,
world of data protection, right? Sales should know that they shouldn't be calling people on the CTPS list, and marketing should know when they shouldn't be sending emails or
just
managing,
back it up.
doing the consent management piece.
Back it up a bit. The CTPS list.
CTPS list is corporate telephone preference service. It's effectively, if I'm on that list, I don't want you calling me.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And so we should be aware of who's on that list and rather who's not on that list, right?
Yeah, and it's just a simple task of, especially in any bot lead lists, is
Yeah,
just screening it against that list and the TPS list, which is for individuals.
great. Learning loads. So Charlie, obviously since Brexit, the UK now is its own standalone. It's a third country. We've got the EU doing their thing. Are both still operating within the same set of rules, same data protection rules?
Relatively, yes. The key difference is the guidance that regulators give out, which again, just speak to your DPO; they can help you out. But the key difference that a salesperson needs to know is the difference in double opt-in and consent. And it's just to say, in countries like the Netherlands or in Germany, double opt-in is a requirement. That in the UK is a little bit less strict on stuff like that, which is an advantage for us.
So it sounds like it's a bit harder over there.
It can be, yeah, it can be for sure. I personally, I'm not sure how they're doing lead gen in the way that we're doing lead gen, but just sounds a little bit more
Anyone in the Netherlands,
vexatious.
if you're listening to this, send me an email so I can help Charlie and myself understand. If you are in the Netherlands and you are trying to reach a marketplace with a cold outbound strategy, we'd love to know how you're doing that. That would be quite interesting, and I'll share whatever you send on the next episode of the podcast or something. But yeah, certainly curious, isn't it? But I guess that's the idiosyncrasies of individual countries, Charlie. You know, everyone's got a slightly different take on how you do things, and I guess the data protection rules and regulations around how you do that apply there as well.
Exactly, and part of it's culture, and part of it is how strong the regulators are at enforcing that regulation.
The wonderful listeners who are based over in the US, of course, don't have it quite as tough, right?
No, they don't. They have well, in lots of US states, there's nothing. At the moment, there's 13 states that have something in place, but from what I've seen in lots of circumstances, like Utah or even in California, is there's a stipulation where the regulation that they've put in place doesn't apply if you are under 25 million in annual turnover, which I think is huge for small businesses.
So just so I've got that right, if you're under 25 million, what your game? you,
Fair game, exactly. Exactly.
So the
Which I think
wild west still
is
exists at least somewhere.
yeah, and I think well, it's with it being rolled out in different states across the U.S., one can only imagine that it's going to become increasingly vexatious until they put in place something like GDPR, where it's done federally, it's across state lines, it makes it simpler for businesses, which coincidentally in the UK we're doing the exact opposite with the new bill that's coming out.
Well, that's a great segue. Let's just talk about that because I picked up on that as well myself recently. So there's a change coming down the tracks. Is that right?
Yeah,
Just describe what top level. What's happening?
sure. So top level is and this is personal opinion, is that the UK is trying to affiliate itself more with the US and how the US has data protection laws versus how it's affiliated with the EU. And so it's trying to make things easier for UK companies. Now, the way in which they've done that, yes, it makes it easier for UK companies, but in my opinion, it actually makes life more difficult for UK companies who are also doing business in the EU, just because there will be more subtle nuances, like things with legitimate interests that we talked about, with the change in title, in name from DPO to Senior Responsible Individual, SRI, just means that businesses in the future that are across the channel and in the UK are going to they're going to need an expert in GDPR even more than they used to.
When are these changes planned to come into effect, Charlie? Has the date been agreed? First of all, is it a fait accompli? Is it definitely happening?
Really, what keeps happening is we keep having a date and then the date gets pushed back. So it's tough to say when exactly it'll come in.
Okay, but something's going through Parliament as we speak, by the sounds.
Yes.
And so, and again, it's all about opinions. I accept that. But what is your opinion on why we are making this change?
Why the UK is making
I'll give you
this
mine
change.
in a minute. But so why? I think the question I'm asking is, if you're happy to answer it, is sounds like the word I'm going to use is relax. We are relaxing a set of rules that have been in place for a while, which were there to protect people like me and you. What the phrase I often hear is data subject. A set of rules to protect us, keep our data as safe as possible. It appears that the government is looking to relax that slightly, so it's less strict. Is that a fair judgment on my part?
I think it's fair to say, and I think it will be more relaxed for companies who are UK based and exclusively in the UK. But I think
We'll
it
come
will
to that in
be
a sec.
more difficult for organizations that are UK and EU.
Got it. But as far as relaxed is concerned, but I suspect that the government would want me to then paraphrase that by saying, because it's going to make business life easier. Fair?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
with the
So that
caveat that it's just for UK
right.
businesses only in the UK.
So there's some changes coming that make it slightly easier for businesses to navigate the world of data protection without losing, ideally, any control over how we keep the other person's data safe. Because this whole GDPR thing, really, what I'm learning from you is it's actually more about keeping the person that comes in contact with your business safe rather than your business safe. The byproduct of keeping their data safe is you maintain the integrity of being a very grown-up business that takes people who come to your company seriously, right?
That's exactly it.
That word DPO we've been referring to now, that data protection officer, that title is going to change. But I think you mentioned something called an SRI.
Yeah, senior responsible individual.
Okay, so it's still going to need somebody in the business to take ownership.
Exactly. Effectively, the idea of the SRI is it relinquishes the conflict of interest problem, whereby previously the DPO couldn't be a COO or a CTO or a CEO. Now that person can be a COO, CTO, CEO. Again, if that company is doing business in the EU, kind of doesn't matter because you still need a DPO.
Yeah, now let's bring that right back to the salespeople so we don't lose them on the
Mm,
technicality of this. So fundamentally, there's some change coming down the tracks. So you need to be aware of those changes, or somebody in your organization needs to be aware of those changes. It's a DPO at the moment. If you haven't got a DPO, you've got to reach out to people like Charlie. He'll help. If the change comes into effect, it's still going to be somebody senior. The great news is it's going to be someone sitting at C-suite like they've got time, but go and talk to them. But for you salespeople, the problem you've now got is if you operate in, let's go with B2B, and you've got a client base that's split across the UK and Europe, I think I've just heard there are now two different rules that you've got to be aware of, not one.
yeah. And I think for a lot
Okay.
of businesses, it'll make a lot more sense to just continue on the EU GDPR track and use that as their gold standard.
Because what you can't go wrong if you've got belt and braces.
Is it still more stringent? It'll just be easier. As a general rule, it's easier to abide by one regulation than two. And for a lot of people, if you abide by EU GDPR, it'll be easier than trying to abide by EU GDPR and then what we'll have in the UK.
Charlie, this change sounds like it could be quite important. I assume if people went onto your website, you must give out some kind of regular information.
Yeah, we sure do.
Okay.
We run a newsletter, the DPIA, that gives up to date news on what's happening here in the UK. We're a UK first business, anyways, and then
Let me put that in the show notes. So what's the so it's DPIA? Did you say?
yeah,
Okay, I'll put something in the show notes. My advice to you is if you want to just keep abreast of this stuff and not get caught out, and certainly share with your marketing colleagues some stuff that might be happening that could have a negative impact, but ideally a positive impact. Go to the show notes and just subscribe to that newsletter. I think that's well worth doing. Okay, look, conscious of your time, just want to cover a couple other bits if we can. AI, without going into any detail, just purely
mm,
looking for a comment or opinion. How does AI and the world of data protection intersect, and then the future? What is this all going to mean? That's too big a question to answer, but you get the idea, right?
no. Well, when we anywhere you go, when you look into AI and where it's going and all the fear mongering that's around it, everyone talks about regulating AI, right? And
Yeah,
regulating AI is data protection fundamentally. I think what's coming down the line is there's the EU AI Act that's still being negotiated at the moment, and it's been negotiated whether it's strict enough. But I think it's going to be more risk for people who are selling AI tools, and it's going to be more risk for businesses procuring AI tools to make sure that they're not left holding the bag with a tool that's inherently biased or inherently hurts the people that it's meant to help, which we've seen a number of different times already.
you got an example. One that comes to my mind would be facial recognition stuff.
Yeah, there's loads of stuff about facial recognition. The immediate one that comes to mind is an estate agent procures an AI tool that helps them identify who's going to be late on their rental payments. However, the tool is inherently biased because of the information that it's trained on, whereby it predominantly chooses people from minority groups, people who have foreign names, people who live in more impoverished areas. And so it naturally sends out the estate agent to chase people who don't necessarily need to be chased. It's just that they're part of a minority or thought to be a group that doesn't have as much money, which isn't right.
Yeah, that sucks. I can certainly see how that then becomes, aside from all the crap that does for the individual who's on the receiving end of it, of course, that's only going to come back and bite that company in the arse, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just from a procurement perspective, it's doing the due diligence to attempt to understand the risks and the inherent biases before a product is bought.
Yeah.
And from a sales perspective, a salesperson's perspective, if you are selling AI tools or you're thinking about moving into a business that does sell an AI tool, it's knowing that due diligence and the customer looking to mitigate their own risk is going to become more and more part of your sales conversations.
Yeah. That's another scary one for the sales listener. I assume one would assume that's bread and butter for you guys, right?
Yeah.
You just
Yeah.
get involved front end. Anyone who's thinking of doing any form of AI, you get involved and effectively do that really interesting thing which stops them reverse engineering the crap and the problems they've created for themselves later.
Exactly. On both sides, on the side of the company that's looking to sell an AI tool or the company that's looking to procure an AI tool.
Charlie, it's been a fascinating conversation. Reminds me just how much there is out there in the world that probably most salespeople only just scrape the surface about knowing, and in some cases kind of avoid wanting to learn about for the fact that it's quite a technical and chewy subject, but you've made it really quite simple. So I'm really grateful to you for that. I want to help those in the sales industry who want to learn more, anybody in marketing as well, so that they can just avoid any of the pitfalls and risks that you've sort of alluded to. Where's the best place for those folks to go, and is there something they can go and get hold of, or what can you do to help them out?
Sure. There's well, first and foremost, feel free, fire me a DM on LinkedIn. I'll do my best to answer your question if you have a specific question. But I think for salespeople, I'll we could put a link in the comment section here on lead gen versus the GDPR and everything you need to know.
Brilliant. Well, I'll make sure we put that link in the show notes. I'll put Charlie's LinkedIn link in the
Yeah.
show notes as well. You're very consistent on LinkedIn. How's that working out for you?
Uh, I do my best. I think a lot of it is vanity, but it does have results for sure.
I listen. Forget the vanity. I love your posts. There's that brilliant blend of advice, value, and humour. So if you're in the world of data protection, you should be following Charlie anyway. If you're in the world of sales, please go and start following, because what Charlie does, I actually use some of your stuff, Charlie. You won't know this, but I'm going to give you.
Oh, do you?
No, I
Okay,
don't. I use it in the people I teach as really good examples of how to engage.
very
So
cool.
leave that to the listeners to go and find you on LinkedIn. Connect with Charlie. I'm sure he's open to the odd question on his DMs about have I done this right or wrong. You'll probably get the advice that most people in that industry give you, which is it depends. But Charlie, I'm sure, knowing Charlie the way I do, he'll go out of his way to do what he can to help you, or he'll put you in contact with someone who can help you. So, Charlie, it's been really great.
Good.
I've loved the conversation. I've just got one final question for you. And you
Sure.
may not be able to answer it. I don't know. I had a recording yesterday with somebody who couldn't answer the question, so there's no problem if you can't. But it's a sort of a spin on that conversation or that question that most people ask, which is what advice would you give to a young Charlie entering the world of sales right now? So I'm
Oh
gonna
man.
no, I'm not going to ask that one. I'm going to flip it. So the question
Yeah.
is, if you could go back in time, is there one place in your past you'd like to just go back to briefly and do something slightly differently? And if so, what was it, and why?
Gosh, that's a great question.
I mentioned
Gosh,
this
that's
on.
such a good question, Matt. I don't know if I have an answer to
No,
that
that's
question.
fine. Let me just. Going to give you a few minutes, a few seconds to think while I tell you mine, and that might stimulate or not. But
Sure.
I used to work in London a long time ago, probably I would say 30 years ago. I used to work in the magazine industry, and part of my job really was making sure that the right ads appeared in the magazine in the right places. And I remember we closed a particular issue of the magazine, one of the high-profile glossies, and I go on holiday for 2 weeks, and I leave the sign off to my number two. And when I came back from holiday, literally the morning I started work was the morning they were printing the magazine on the printing presses. I just happened to check it, which was the sort of the mock-up magazine, and I noticed that on the outside back cover was the wrong ad. Right organisation, Estee Lauder, I think it was the fragrance company, but it was the wrong ad.
Mm.
And sort of like blood draining from my face. And so I had to ring up the printers and stop the press, huge amount of money and all the rest of the nonsense that goes with it. And ultimately it was my fault. But here's the thing. When I got called into the publisher's office, I threw my number 2 under the bus.
Mm.
And I've regretted that ever since. Ever since
Yeah.
it happened. And actually, to be fair, I got my just desserts because I ended up got in real trouble, and I got taught a lesson about leadership. So that was my moment. If I could go back to, I think it was 1992, if I could go back to that moment where I was just before I went on holiday, I would have done something slightly differently. I don't know if that stimulated or prompted you or made you think of one.
I don't know if I have a specific instance, but in general, I would tell myself, go slow. If a deal looks good, slow it down.
Yeah.
If it doesn't look good, speed it up and get it off your desk. Right? I think that would be the biggest one. Slow
That's
down, slow down.
That's stellar advice. I totally agree with that. Charlie Gretton, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Really, really enjoyed it. As I said to folks, if you want to know a bit more, Charlie's your man. Just go and connect with him on LinkedIn. But thanks ever so much for taking time out of your day to join us on the Sales Cadence podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it. And if I might say, there's still a lot of stuff that I use from working with you that I use every day these days in every call that I get on. So thank you.
Love to hear it, mate. Fascinating conversation. Love spending time in Charlie's company. He reminds me a lot, actually. He's got a bit like the Chris Voss radio DJ voice, hasn't he? He's got that kind of very relaxed and pragmatic approach. But trust me when I tell you, this guy, having spent time in his company, he's a sales assassin, folks. But he's an expert in data protection, so I highly recommend checking him out. All the stuff you need is in the show notes. What's happening in the world of Sales Cadence? Well, Leads to Sales. It's a half-day workshop that I run. Been running it in person for the last 6 months. It always sells out, but of course it means it's restricted just to Norfolk, where I live here in the UK. So it's about time it went online. So you'll find on the website salescadence.co.uk, you'll find information about the online version of Leads to Sales. So wherever you are in the world, if you want to learn how to effectively take a lead to a close, then that could well be for you. Go and check it out on the website. Folks, thanks ever so much for spending time in my company today. Hope you're getting loads out of the podcast. I really love bringing them to you, and I'm really looking forward to bringing you the next one to you. So stay tuned. Look forward to seeing you on the next one.